how was the Quran transmitted? How was the Quran transmitted? So people, Islam, when the Prophet lived amongst people and the companions after him, there was a living tradition of Islam. If we can call that a living tradition, okay, living tradition is what people will just teach. Parents will teach their children. There will be, it will just become a kind of folk practice. It will just permeate through communities and societies. It is part and parcel of the living tradition. Now the Quran was transmitted en masse. Like people, you know, they just taught it. They taught it to their children. They taught it to their neighbors. They taught it to their friends. People conveyed the message of the Quran. Before the arrival or advent of institutionalization. So as a natural, as a deen of fitrah, the Quran was being transmitted. So if I knew the Quran, I would read it in my salah, I would read the Quran in my daily prayers, I would teach it to my children, I might sometimes have a discussion on it. This was just the natural living practice that people were passing on the Quran, one could say from father to child. Okay, there was not an institutionalization to it. It was just a natural tradition. The other thing is, and this is something nobody would really deny, that Muslims were doing this. I mean, even non-Muslim historians, they acknowledge that yes, Muslims, they had this scripture. They had this thing called the Quran. Secondly, the Quran by its nature, ontologically, by its essence, okay, is a Quran. It's a recitation. It's a recital of something. It's not prose. It's not something like, here's a book, right? It's not a book like you just read, like I'm just reading this book. It was a recitation, which meant it had a rhythmic essence to it. So people would recite, and we know that the Quran was preserved by memory. So people would recite the Quran, they would read it in their salah, they would read it during Ramadan, in Taraweeh. It was being conveyed, it was just being taught. And this is how it permeates through the communities. It was just part and parcel of the living tradition of Islam. What is the problem, I ask you, what is the problem, or the challenge is a better word, with trying to push your false teachings into the Quran? What do you think would be the problem? If you were a person, pretend you are a person who is intentionally, because if we take the worst case scenario first, we can deal with the other cases by extension easily. So those people who are intentionally premeditating an attempt to corrupt the faith, they want to mess up the teachings of Islam. What would be your challenges if you were trying to add verses into the Quran? You know very well that that would not fly. It would be so difficult. Why? Number of reasons. One, the Quran is so widespread. People are reciting it all the time. So if I wanted to, I don't know, say, add a ruling into the Quran, I have to match the entire context of the Quran. So let's say I wanted to invent some hadith to support the state of Bani Umayyah, the Umayyad dynasty. Now, I can't just add a verse of the Quran saying, hey, and there will be a great dynasty called Bani Umayyah. Because the Quran, it's not its style to speak like that. So this becomes very difficult. The other thing is the Quran does not often delve into tiny issues. It seems to have a very universal approach. It's speaking about things universally. And fabricating a universal is very meaningless. Like, if I want to fabricate a universal ruling, the problem is so many people read the Quran in different parts of the world. All these people read it. It's part and parcel of the tradition. I have to then make sure this thing matches the exact style. It matches the context. It doesn't go against the overall message of the Quran. So some people did try this with the satanic verses. And it flopped. Why did it flop? Because it clashed with the overall message, and people spotted it as a contradiction. And so the return on investment here is very little. It's not worth trying to corrupt the Quran with that in mind, because you're not going to get much back out of it. Okay. This, however, is not the same with hadith. The hadith don't have a context. The hadith were not being taught from father to child. They were not part of this living tradition, unless, maybe a one-off story may have been, but hadith weren't. Hadith start to get documented almost 100 years after the Prophet. By that time, many false hadith are in circulation. For me to make up a hadith, all I have to say is, the Prophet said, whosoever doesn't watch Monday Nights with Mufti has lost out on a great big fortune, for example. That's it. Trying to add that in the Quran is impossible. Next to impossible. Why? Because one, the Quran doesn't talk about things like this in general, so people will spot it. Two, I have to match the rhythm, the nazm, the flow of the Quran. I have to choose a particular surah to add it into. Then people are all reciting that surah in different parts of the world. It wouldn't really fly. So this is why people did not corrupt the Quran in that way. It wasn't a project that they could see a return on investment in. So when people say, but if you problematize hadith, then you by default problematize the Quran. No, you don't at all. The Quran was never transmitted through a sole transmitter. It was just taught en masse. That's it. Now, yes, when the hadith culture takes off, the hadith project becomes so powerful that it pours into many other aspects of Muslim tradition. So the way in hadith you have a chain. So this chain and everything started to get documented over 100 years after the Prophet. So when hadith were first documented in the time of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, the chains weren't being documented. But then within a decade or two after him, people start to document the chains. And then they started to say, well, that person, we're not so sure if he's reliable, or that person and that person. And they did a great job of trying to scrutinize the chains, but it's not infallible. Okay, so it's still susceptible to error. Now, later on, this hadith project becomes so fashionable that people start to have chains in everything. You see, it becomes the thing. It's not like, it's like I give you an example. Snapchat, for example, had stories which were so, the stories that you have, the 24-hour stories, which are still there, became so fashionable that all other social media outlets started to adopt stories. Your Facebook Messenger has a story, Instagram has a story, bloody everything. Microsoft Excel would probably have a story. So everybody just takes up something that starts to really take off. Now, in a similar way, once the Hadith project became a dominating project, which it did, you see everybody, even if you're learning Arabic grammar, which has got nothing, think about it, what has Arabic grammar got to do with the chain of transmission? But all of a sudden, they too now have chains of transmission. Oh, I took this from my teacher, who took it from Farra, who took it from Kasai, who took it from... I mean, it's nothing to do with, you know, who cares, it's grammar. But no, we're going to have a chain of transmission in it. Oh, where did you learn this from? I learned it from here. Where did you learn this poetry from? I took it from him, who took it from him, who took it from this Imam Shafi'i's poem. So this chain of transmission, isnad, just as a superfluous event, not as something carrying actual meaning, as a trend, it trickles into all other sciences, which were just normal teaching, normal thing, and some were part of the living tradition. So fiqh, for example, people say, well, if you don't have hadith, how do you know how to pray? Because it was part of the living tradition. See, the living tradition predates the documentation of fiqh. It was just what the parents taught their children. And it was part and parcel of the Muslim community. So this fiqh now, all of a sudden, people start to have a chain in it. Oh, where did you get it from? I got it from him, who got it from him. Oh, wow, I like this chain. So what started to happen is the Quran too, people started to transmit in chains. But so some people naively thought that because the Quran has a chain as well now, oh, so it must have been taught only through chains, the way Hadith was taught. That is a mistake on their part. That's like saying because Arabic grammar had a chain, so everybody who ever knew Arabic grammar knew it because he must have studied it all through this one guy who taught it through a chain. That's ridiculous. So I hope that sheds some clarity on this kind of fallacy that the way Hadith was transmitted is how the Quran was transmitted. It was not. The Quran was transmitted as part of the living tradition, was transmitted en masse. Hadith was transmitted as an institution. So people sat down and taught it. Okay. Now, during this discussion in Aqidah, they discussed something called tawatur. They said, well, tawatur is one way you can acquire knowledge. You can say, well, how do you know China exists? In the past, they would say, well, I know because it's common knowledge. Everybody knows it. Duh. They wouldn't have made it up just to trick me. They go, well, fine. Common knowledge will accept as a means of knowledge, you see. So this is where the discussion of tawatur enters. Now, why was this important? This was important in the sense of how do we, using our knowledge, arrive at God and argue, is there a God, isn't there a God? How do we argue with evidences? Because people will say, well, I know this, well, what is knowledge anyway? And that's why you discuss epistemology. So I just wanted to clarify the backdrop to where this comes in. Then along comes Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, right? So he, in his writing his book on hadith, brings in the discussion tawatur for no reason. It's nothing to do with hadith. The question was, look, how do we know that the Prophet, the discussion of hadith was, how do you, okay, the Prophet said this, but how do you know the Prophet said it? And somebody said, well, I know because he told me, and he told him, and he told him. So, well, okay, that's fine. Say, but they could be wrong. True, they could be. Oh, but what if it was common knowledge that the Prophet said something? Say, well, sure. If it's common knowledge, it's mutawatir. It's like China, like they couldn't have all been lying about that. So, okay, so he puts this topic in as a discussion in Usul Hadith, thereby opening a can of worms, ain't even the word actually, opening Pandora's box to a calamity that would come later on. So what happened from here, some scholars started to say, we've found mutawatir hadith. So you're like, what on earth are you on about? So they've started to say, well, so you have some people, like, so for example, one of the revolutionaries of Usul Hadith, Ibn Salah, to be fair to him, he writes in his Muqaddimah that actually mutawatir hadith is very unlikely to ever exist in hadith. He says it's very unlikely. He's quite dismissive of it. But Ibn Hajar, by his time, he says, what are you talking about? Mutawatir, okay, how many people, common knowledge, like if I asked you, how many people do you need to tell you to believe in something? So these people had this discussion in the past, and they wrote 40 people, and then somebody said 20 people, and somebody said 12, and somebody said 10, somebody said 5, somebody said 4. So they started writing these down in the books. Oh, this is, for it to be common knowledge, at least this many people must say. So Ibn Hajar is like he caused havoc in our tradition by actually pushing this thing of, actually, of course, a hadith can be mutawatir. How can it be mutawatir? 10 people say it's fine, alhamdulillah, it's impossible to now be a lie. And you think, whoa, hold your horses, mate. Why is that impossible for 10 people to get it wrong? So this whole discussion of mutawatir is nonsensical. This is why I asked these people, show me in the early scholars anybody who ever spoke of it. Imam Malik, Imam Bukhari, Imam Muslim, Abu Dawood, these great scholars, Nisa'i, Ibn Majah, and in their times, you've got who? Ibn Hibban, who has his great hadith book, Ibn Hibban does. He's one of the major scholars of that era of hadith collection. What does he actually say? He says there is no such thing as mutawatir hadith. All hadith is isolated narrations. That means one person heard it from the Prophet, from him usually just one person, maybe 2 people, and that's how it works. Even if you get multiple one people, but it is still just an isolated narration. So he said that. You had Abu Bakr al-Hazmi endorsing his statement. You had Ibn Abi Dam endorsing his statement. These were all scholars saying, look, there is no such thing as mutawatir. Even Imam Shatibi saying that, look, this is a fruitless discussion. It really didn't belong in Usul Hadith at all. So today, what happened is the scholars, anything they wanted to push, they just started to claim the Hadith is mutawatir.